you for listening to the Drinks.com podcast, the business of online alcohol. I'm your host, Brandon Amoroso, and today I'm talking with the founder and CEO of Firstleaf, Philip James. And Firstleaf is a personalized D2C wine club. Thank you for coming on the show.
Brandon, thank you for having me.
So before we hop into some of the topics we want to cover today, can you just give everybody a quick background on yourself and Firstleaf?
Yeah, of course. So I grew up in the UK and moved to the US for graduate school. And ever since graduating with my MBA, I've been in the online wine industry. So that's all the way back since 2005. You know what? It's funny. I thought kind of the internet was fully baked back then. You know, even Amazon was 10 years old. eBay, Amazon, like all these big ones were more than roughly a decade old at that point. But obviously in terms of online wine, it was like nascent, right? Back then, a winery could only ship to 10 states. I think maybe $1 billion of wine was sold online. And kind of fast forward to today, wineries can ship nearly nationwide, or effectively nationwide, 47 states now. And, I think the industry is 4, 5, 6 times bigger than it was back then. So I started my first company in 2006, 2007, I think. And I've started a few since then, and they've all been focused on the same consumer problem, but with different kind of back end solutions, if that makes sense. And so starting with Snooth, Lot 18 in the middle, and ending, now obviously where I am with Firstleaf. And so in all cases, it is me coming into the industry not as a wine person at first, and never really understanding why it had to be so complicated, why the consumer, the consumer always feels like misjudged, right? I still don't like picking wine in a restaurant. I find it hard to choose wine in a grocery store. There's so much choice on the shelf or on the list, and so little relevant information to help the consumer make a choice. And so I've always tried to help a consumer find a wine that matches their taste. And at first I try to do that solely through software. And then gradually, that evolution up to Firstleaf, where we said, look, to do it properly, to do it completely, we think we have to, make the wine, handle the e-commerce, and do the sort of software-based recommendations to help the consumer.
Yeah, I think one of the benefits to online is you can curate it, more specifically than a shelf in a retail shop or a wine list at a restaurant, and it is pretty overwhelming. And more often than not, the recommendations that you're getting from people, in the store or at the restaurant, they're not necessarily recommendations tailored to what you would want or should be drinking. It's more like, oh, we've got a lot of this wine, we really need to push it this week, type of deal, versus actually thinking about what sort of flavor profile would go with, your food, or, what your preferences might be.
The question I hear a consumer ask an expert most commonly is, do you like it, right? What do you like, right? So someone is in a store and unless you're a sommelier, unless you've been trained, WSET course or something like that, why would you know how a tannin is different than, acids or mouthfeel or fruitiness and sweetness? These are words that you learn over time, and we know what the words are, right? But you learn what that taste is and how to discern it in the wine. And most people don't have that lexicon, right? And so a consumer will say to the sommelier, just tell me one that you like, right? But that's kind of ridiculous, really, right? What's the point of having all of this choice if you just, as a consumer, have to give up, right? And instead of knowing how to explain what you might like and someone giving you an actual recommendation in person, you just get something that somebody else likes. Again, what's the point, right? You might as well, at that point, you might as well just pick randomly. Probably everything on the list and probably everything in the store is good to somebody, right? Somebody likes it. That's why it's there, right? And so if you may as well just close your eyes and pick it. Like asking somebody else what they like, you may as well just close your eyes and pick at random. And so, yeah, obviously online makes that easier because you know who the person is, where they live, you have their purchase history. For us, we ask consumers to tell us if they like a wine or not. They can also get on the phone and talk to one of our like wine concierge and actually dial in their account and kind of have a 10-20 minute conversation back and forth and like, oh, I didn't realize you didn't like highly tannic wines. Let's make sure we remove those off the top. Or for whatever
Mm.
reason, you don't like French wine. Hey, no problem. We'll just make sure you never get a French wine. And so, trying to help people find a wine they like while knowing that they don't necessarily have the language, the words to describe their own taste. That's hard, right? Like, try and describe a fragrance to me. Like, if you don't work in that world, good luck describing that's musk, that's vanilla, that's something else. That's hard, right? I mean, I can't explain music. I know what I like, but I don't know the words to explain it.
Yeah. And I think, one of the unique advantages to online is that you can actually dig into that, create that one-to-one relationship with a customer in a way that, you're not getting in, a retail store or at a restaurant. But what are some of the ways that you're tackling, that problem specifically with Firstleaf? Because you mentioned software, you're obviously selling through an online sales channel. Like, what does that actually look like in practice?
So there's a few things that I think kind of sum up to the service and the whole personalization that we offer. The first one is when a consumer shows up and creates an account, we ask them to take this sort of basic onboarding quiz, right? And that helps us understand how much they know about wine, if there are certain things they know they like or don't like. So certain styles of wine, region grape combinations, and then some sort of maybe simpler questions around the kinds of foods they like, right? So that gives us a pretty good match, but it obviously is not perfect, right? That's just they haven't tried a wine and they haven't given us actual feedback on the wine, but it helps triangulate reasonably well. The second way is over time, as they receive wines from us, they can rate those, simple thumbs up or thumbs down, and then that narrows it in. I talked about at some point, if someone wants to get on the phone and talk to the wine concierge and like manually accelerate that and dial in the account faster, they can do that. And then that's all the front end. That's what the consumer sees, right? And then behind the scenes, what we're doing, we run our own lab, we use something called a FOSS machine. That's an infrared spectroscopy machine. So basically, the big machine looks like a fridge turned on its side, and it's what our algorithm and personalization runs off of, right? So this machine basically like blasts an infrared light at a test tube of the wine and tells you which frequencies reflect back and which ones pass through. So my master's thesis was in a very similar technology at Chemistry Masters, but actually our head winemaker has a PhD actually in this infrared spectroscopy science and that machine. And so our algorithm runs off it, our recommendations run off it. That information is really important back to the winemakers in terms of what we should buy and how a wine should be finished to match like a kind of a style that a certain group of consumers would like. And so it's the core of what goes on behind the scenes. And so, I think what we're good at is we ask pretty basic questions. So do you like sweet red wine, or, do you like sweeter food, or do you like oaky Chardonnay, yes or no? And most people can answer those questions. But that kind of belies the complexity of what's going on behind the scenes. And so wine is complex, right? I mean, wine is at least 1,000 different grapes from at least 1,000 different regions. And often in a store, there could be 1,000 or 5,000 different bottles on the shelf. Pretty hard to pick from that complexity. We're doing a lot of math behind the scenes, but trying to present it to the consumer in a really simple and approachable way.
Yeah, it's crazy to me how much choice there is, but also how much science goes into, the creation of, a bottle of wine. And there's, definitely, from the various wineries that I visited, there's some that are super advanced when it comes to, you're basically almost making the wine in a lab. It seems like at some properties, and then at others, it's very much so like, natural, the way it used to be done for for centuries. I don't know if there's necessarily a, a right or wrong way, but it is fascinating to me that you can basically engineer, a wine to fit somebody's flavor profile, pretty specifically. Um, and so I'm assuming that, for most of your wines there, you're going the private label route and you're, um, you know, crafting based off of, the feedback that you're getting from your customers.
So everything we sell, we make,
Yeah.
and so the brands and the brand identity, the label and the packaging, all of that's designed in house, and we both will buy on contract from vineyards, as well as through brokers and the kind of the spot market. In some cases, we have long-term contracts that run multiple years, and we buy from wineries, you would have heard of, but we also buy from wineries that are smaller, family-owned, multi-generation. And in some cases, we can say exactly who the source is, and in some cases, we don't. And look, the terroir, the varietal clone, the grape, the farming, the harvesting, the fermenting, all of that's really important, right?
Mhm.
But there's also, for us, out of hundreds of thousands of different choices, we have to pick which vineyard, which grape, right? Which year. We have to pick those things. And then the blend, right? Sometimes 100%, but some of the wines are red blend or 50-50, right? That will make all these, different blends. And so, for sure, there's a lot of science before we pick up the wine. So the farming and the harvesting. But then there is also that science that occurs after we pick it up, right? The blending, the aging, the finishing, and so on. And so, yeah, the science is useful. The math and science is so on is useful for us at both. Just think of how it's different for a traditional winery, right? If you're a Napa winery, you buy some Napa land maybe, and you put a building on it. That's
Mhm.
not how a lot of wine is made, right? A lot of the wine is made. You'll visit a Napa winery and then they might have a wine from Monterey. Maybe they own the land in Monterey. Maybe they don't. Maybe they buy from other vineyards. And there's a lot of vineyards out there, the growers out there that don't want to be involved in the marketing and the branding and the selling of the wine. And so the wine industry is a lot more complicated behind. I mean, you know this, of course, but the industry is a lot more complicated and disaggregated behind the scenes than the average consumer thinks, right? The consumer shows up at a winery on a weekend, tastes the wine, and sees a vineyard out back, and they assume that everything comes from that vineyard, but
Mhm.
not many wineries do that. If they do that, they put the word estate on the bottle. And I'm not sure what the exact percentage is, but I'm sure it's less than 5%, maybe less than 1 or 2% of wine is estate, right? And even big famous brands are maybe growing some, but buying some and sort of blending it, as they go to create that consistent style. So there's a lot of like science that has to go in even before they take it to the lab, right? And like you said, the lab is the room next to the barrel room, right? And some labs have, you know, uh, a couple of machines, and some labs, actually look like a real laboratory. And every winery kind of picks where they go on that spectrum. But, it is ultimately a incredibly complex product with hundreds of different chemicals in it, molecules in it. Those are all natural, right? They're from the grape, they're from the yeast and the fermentation, and they're from the barrel and kind of nothing else. But it's still a product with hundreds and hundreds of different molecules in it. And so the science of taste is super complicated, right? Just like, again, fragrance or music or something like that. But it's crazy how something with so few ingredients, I mean, less than five, right? Can create a product with so much variability and subtlety and nuance.
Yeah, and it's crazy how much the label and the packaging and all that goes into consumer choice when when they're deciding what they're going to purchase, but also their perception or idea of what it's going to taste like. Like if I'm in a store and I see like an old school Bordeaux style label and bottle, and if you pick it up and it's like heavier, maybe it has like a larger punt as well. I think, oh, this is going to be, expensive, more classic,
Tannic,
traditional. Yeah.
dry.
If I see, one of those like nouveau, crazy labels, maybe it's like AR, enabled as well. A cork, not a cork, a twist off versus a cork. My mind immediately goes to, cheaper, maybe more approachable, like fun and fruity or something like that. Um, and that initial perception feeds so much into what the taste actually ends up being because your mind is so powerful in like creating, what that flavor profile might be. Like if you tell somebody, oh, it's going to taste like this, they're probably going to taste, whatever you just told them it's going to taste like.
The and what you're describing is still 750 ml round glass bottles,
Mm.
right? And I know there's cans and boxes and Tetra Pak and other stuff, but how long before the TTB allows wineries to make wine outside of 750? I don't mean 500 or 1.5 or 1 liter, but every now and then they consider allowing any size. So instead of 750, you could have 700 or 720 or 730. And how long before wine ends up like fragrance or bottled water, where when you look at the shelf, there's like all kinds of stuff, right? You can get bottled water in plastic, but you can also get it in glass and, slightly different sizes and squeezable or fancy Voss that you might put on a table, like a decanter almost fragrance, right? Every fragrance basically has a different glass mold. And
Right.
so, I think there will be more and more like, but for retail particularly, right? This isn't as relevant for us because we're selling Firstleaf as a service, first of all, and then the bottles that come in the box are what we provide as the service. You sign up for Spotify because you want music on demand, right? You don't really look through their catalog and decide who has the richer catalog before you pick a music service. So
Mm.
we have to sell Firstleaf, right? But for wineries that sell on the shelf, I mean, when there's 1,000 things and you all have similar packaging, like you said, you have to differentiate on the label and the brand. But I think over time, there's going to be more and more people really pushing to differentiate on the bottle, the packaging, outside of the label itself. And fragrance and water, I mean, water particularly, right? Where it's kind of all the same. I know there's minerality, but other than that, it's basically all the exact same. And
Yeah.
people have a preferred water brand, right? They have a preferred vodka brand. They certainly have a preferred fragrance. And I think wine historically hasn't had great brand identity. Wine does, but not the individual brands, right? When you think how people shop, a lot of people say, I like Cabernet Sauvignon and I'll pay $20, or I love New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc. Most people are not shopping by brand; they're saying they want a region and a grape, right, or a price range and a grape. But you don't really say that with vodka, right? You go in and you say, I want Smirnoff or Absolute. You don't say, I'm looking for a $20 vodka. So
Right.
people have brand identity or brand loyalty in many other categories, and it exists in wine. I think maybe somebody walks in and they're a yellowtail drinker or barefoot wine drinker, but usually no. And most people are absolutely open to like the power of substitution, suggestion,
Hmm.
right? Oh, you love Cloudy Bay. We don't have that, but here's a different New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc, and it's similar, and you'll love it. It's hard to do that in vodka, right? You either want absolute vodka or nothing, I think.
Yeah.
Here's a different vodka, but like, no, you're brand loyal. And so I think one of wine's challenges with its so many products out there, the average winery brand is small, right? Lower budget. It's hard to build loyalty at the brand level. Anyway, but like I said, Firstleaf has a different challenge and opportunity. We're trying to get people to believe in Firstleaf, the service, which is we'll pick the wine, we'll also get it to your door, and all the other stuff that goes into the service than just the bottles and the wine itself.
What are some of the things that you're excited about for this year that you think you're uniquely positioned to capitalize on because you are selling, online and direct to consumer, something that, a lot of producers aren't necessarily privy to or able to take advantage of.
I think this, to me, this marks the end of the pandemic, and you know, there's a bit of an arbitrary line deciding when the end of the pandemic really is. But I started the company in 20, or we launched in 2016, and in hindsight, those first few years were a more predictable time. Didn't feel so at the time, but then 2020 came, and I realized I missed, 2016 to 2019. And maybe the pandemic itself was over sooner, but the effects from the pandemic were not, right? So the supply chain challenges in 2021 and 2022 were crazy, right? Interest rates are high. A lot of wineries, I think, ended up with sort of too much stock, or, for us, we import a lot of wine, and containers, shipping a container of wine used to cost like $3,000, but briefly it was nearly $20,000. And so kind of working through that is pretty much done now. And so for me, this is our first like clean and hopefully predictable year since 2020. And so it's nice to be able to focus back on like the basics, basically, right? So focusing on the consumer and the value proposition and the actual business, and not reacting to these external events that, I felt like we're a small boat in a giant ocean being whipped around by things that were happening to us. So we're spending a lot of time this year focusing on the breadth of the portfolio. There's a lot of really good wine out there right now. We are putting a lot of energy into our mobile app. And we launched that last year, and that's good both for Firstleaf members. So manage your account, your next delivery, rate a wine, pull up the information. But we're also building out this library of third-party wines that you can scan somebody else's wine, right? Like a liquor store or grocery store, and you can pick up a bottle and scan the barcode, and we'll tell you based on our personalization if we think it's a good match for you. And I really like that, because to believe and then try Firstleaf today, you have to believe two things are true, right? You have to believe our recommendations will work for you, and you have to believe that the wine we have is good. And you have to believe those things at the same time, right? Then you sign up and create an account. But if you download the mobile app, you can play with and try the recommendations in some other setting. You can try it on your wine at home. You can try it at a friend's barbecue. You can try it in a grocery store. And I think if the recommendations are good, we've like helped you, right? We've created something that can help you even without you putting your credit card down and paying for the service. So I love the idea that we can take our technology and kind of open it up and push it out to people who I think over time will want to try Firstleaf wines, but separating the two pieces so you can play with the recommendations first and then decide later if you want to try our wine.
Yeah, no, that's exciting. I think the 2021 to 2023 like COVID period was crazy for industries, beyond just wine. I mean, pretty much any industry had crazy supply chain woes. There was a lot of overbuying, then underbuying, then pretty much no ability, at least from like the marketing standpoint, to do year over year comparables or even month over month, because it's just completely different like dynamic that you're operating within. And so like looking at even performance for this year with like with the marketing agency for for some of our clients, it's very challenging to have a real baseline. I feel like this is the year that you'll be able to set that baseline again, and then be able to move forward and improve, versus trying to compare it to a year where people were quite literally forced to shop online.
And not just so you're right. I mean, the comparisons are crazy, but it's not just that people were forced to shop online. It's that they bought different things. I mean, I have a giant piece of exercise equipment at home, but now I can go back to the gym, right? So in 2020, I bought a home rowing machine. I don't know if I would have bought that today. Certainly, everybody bought cooking equipment, and lots of people bought, at-home desks or office furniture, or people purchased new couches. Everybody was at home all the time, right? And now the balance of how people spend their money shifts, right? People are back out traveling, doing other stuff, and so yeah, I mean, a lot of wine companies had too much inventory, but like you said, a lot of other companies end up with a bit of the wrong inventory, right? Now is not the best time to sell someone a couch or a desk, and
Hmm.
maybe it's a better time to sell someone, I don't know, luggage or something different, right? And so, there's been a lot of like derivative effects from the pandemic. And I think most consumers think the pandemic ended, I don't know, 2 years ago, right? Vaccines, lockdowns, like that stuff is all in the past now. COVID's still around, right? But its effects are less than it used to be. But I think for a lot of companies, the effects are still present, right? On their inventory and supply chain and so on. And so, yeah, I think so far it's only February, right? But so far it's like a clean year. But it's weird. What's the comparison? I mean, for us, I do try to compare to pre-pandemic, although it's ridiculous. I have investors and they don't love it when I tell them, let's do a comparison to 4 years ago. But we are more than twice the size that we were in 2019. We've been profitable since 2020 every year. We're debt free. And so in that arc of lockdowns and supply chain, there's ebb and flow and up and down, but point to point, pre-pandemic to post-pandemic, we're definitely a bigger, you know, more sound, a better company. But it's a longer comparison than most investors love to hear about, right? They
Yeah.
want to hear how this quarter is versus last quarter, not how we are today versus 2019.
Yeah. Yeah. I think, it's more resilient businesses though have come out of COVID. If you were able to survive, that period, which a lot of businesses were not able to, you definitely have some battle scars from it. But if you were able to handle, every day was a new sort of dynamic with which you're working within, now is like a breath of fresh air, even though like for ecom, at least for a lot of our clients, total sales are lower than what they were in like 2022. They might be coming in different channels, but your Shopify sales aren't necessarily as high as they were, when everybody was quite literally forced to, shop online. But it's less like helter skelter, and everything is more streamlined, and you're able to focus on how to actually grow the business versus how to just keep it alive given all the changing conditions.
Yeah, and and it's an unfair comparison to say how are sales wherever, not for us, but for anyone today versus when lockdowns, like you said, were compulsory, basically. So that's a bit of a weird comparison, right? But I like that, the metrics in general start to feel normal again. The channels we're in, the price, the CPA, the prices, the consumer behavior, it's all starting to look a bit more predictable. And yeah, there were crazy effects during the last few years, but the margin structure, the cost structure, like things start to look normal. They remind me of how they were in 2019. But I think the ripples from the pandemic will go on at least to the end of this decade. Think of how many people work from home now versus before.
Yeah.
Think of how the default for a business meeting is like a Zoom call, whereas the default used to be I get on a plane and fly to the vendor. And so I think it's something like 20 to 25% of people work from home to some degree now, but pre-pandemic that was 3%, right? And so I'm sure the impact on San Francisco is always in the news, maybe New York City, commercial real estate. I think there's still a lot of disruption, right? All the people that moved out of those kinds of cities and moved into whether it's Texas or Florida or other states. I mean,
Yeah.
there's a big change. I don't think everybody's fully understood, right? So more people at home means more people can get home delivery, but that's also terrible for, I don't know, public transport, or what happened to like the salad bar in Manhattan, or the dry cleaning place in Manhattan. I don't dress up as often as I used to. I used to have to put on a shirt and go to see clients a lot, and I don't do that very much anymore.
Yeah, it's just like massive shifts. I feel like that, you know, maybe 50 years ago, things would happen in, longer periods of time. Whereas if you look at just the last 4 years alone, there's been dramatic shifts in, weeks, not, months, not even years. And so as a business, you have to be able to, adjust very rapidly and be pretty dynamic. And the world is becoming more interconnected and global, and people aren't as, you know, stuck within wherever they currently are in the sense of, a lot of businesses had the opportunity during COVID to ask, why is our footprint in this particular area? Why couldn't it be, elsewhere? Or why couldn't it be in multiple different places? And then even looking at the dynamic between the employee and the employer, that's shifted like 4 times in the past 3 years, where the employees had a ton of power, then it went back to the employer, then it was the employees, and it's the employer again with layoffs and not having layoffs. It's it's definitely not a an industry for people who don't like to be nimble or on their toes.
But I mean, how many industries are going to be left that aren't affected by technology? I mean, there's less and less and less, and even farming, right, which are like, that's going to be the last to get affected by technology. I mean, the stuff that exists out there, right? Optical sorters for grapes,
Yeah,
unbelievable. I mean, they're so much faster than a human can do it, and they can spot the bad grape and like puff it out the way with a 3D blast of air. And people used to say that they wouldn't use mechanical harvesting, so I don't know, the machines like the tall
yeah,
tractors basically that can roll down the vines, and unless it's hillside, a lot of people will use those now. And look, and some technology is good. I think it was something like 10% of wine was corked back in the day, right? But now the way that cork is, I don't know, washed, right? The actual cork, the way it's cleaned, I guess they don't really have that, whatever TCA is. I'm not sure if it's a bacteria. I think it is. So that TCA bacteria doesn't really exist. I mean, it exists, but it's not like, I don't know, it's instead of 1 in 10 corks, it's 1 in 1 million corks or something. I'm not sure of the actual data, but like, hey, some technology is good, right? And reaches into even, the sort of slowest industries to adopt it. I mean, for a year now, I've really been pushing my team on generative AI, which is so useful, kind of up and down the entire stack, right? We use it on the actual website. So when a consumer logs in, there's a thing we create called Wine Print, which is sort of like your personalized analytics. Generative AI writes the copy on that page, and they do it because we need it to be basically unique, right? We can't write all the versions by hand. So generative AI takes the data input and spits back out the sentences that we show the consumer. So, hey, I like wines that are medium acid, high tannin, lower alcohol, and you can show a sommelier and be like, get me this, right? We talked about the challenge people have in a grocery store. That's what we're trying to help solve, with Wine Print. But we use it behind the scenes. We use it for image generation, copy generation. We use it to analyze consumer feedback, right? So we get too many emails, or if we send out a survey, we get too many responses to like, we read them all, but you can't really get the sentiment of them. It's a bit like a word cloud or a tag cloud, right? You need to understand like generally what the feedback is,
yeah.
and generative AI can read it and spit you out a summary, right? So, people have issues around shipping, or people have issues around, whatever else, price or whatever else. The thing is, you can get the summary from that data so much better and faster than the idea of having, someone read 5,000 responses and try to count how many mentioned the word shipping.
Yeah, it's kind of
And
like what
so,
Google is doing with its generative search. And if you Google something now, you can get that blurb at the top that basically just takes the hundreds of thousands of results that Google has, and then gives you a nice little description without you having to click into 10 different articles. Which is a big disruptor when it comes to like SEO, but for the customer or for the searcher, it's a significantly better experience.
Yeah, look, and I know, of course, people worry that tech takes their job, but I think generally using generative, like, you need someone to use the generative AI and make sure it makes sense, right? Because if you just let it spit it back out, you get the images where someone has 5 arms and 7 fingers, right? So you still get junk comes back out of it. So I'm really pushing my team to be the user of it rather than have it replace their job, right? Like if you don't embrace it, it will replace your job. But if you embrace it, there's always going to need to be people who train it or work with it or edit it or oversee it. And so, I like the description that it's like generative AI is like having infinite high school interns.
Yeah.
Those high school interns need a lot of oversight because you can't just let them run the company,
Right.
right? And so, yeah, maybe one day it becomes infinite college grads, and I should worry. But at the moment, it still absolutely needs a human layer on top
Yeah.
to interpret it or prompt it. But it's out there, and you either have to use these things or let them pass you by.
And it makes me far more efficient and productive. And, I look at it as I'm able to do more now than less. And I think, that's the way that people need to approach it. Um, but this is a super insightful conversation. I really appreciate you coming on. Uh, is there, before we hop though, where can people, who are listening find you, connect with you online?
Well, Firstleaf is easy to find. That's just firstleaf.com. And I'm Philip James. Easiest way is to find me on LinkedIn and connect. But yeah, Brandon, thank you very much for having me here.
Yeah, of course. Thank you. Well, for everyone else listening, as always, this is Brandon Amoroso. You can find us at drinks.com. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.